Welcome to the course Theories of Violent Conflict in the MA Conflict Studies and Human Rights. This is the opening lecture. My name is Jolle Demmers and I'll be your lecturer for the coming weeks in this course. We'll start with some organizational stuff as always, and then I move into a brief lecture on images of war and their underlying questions, a short case study on the London riots, and then something about the main objectives of this course. So let's start with the more organizational things. I sent you the syllabus it's uploaded on Blackboard, and basically in the syllabus you find everything that you need to know about this course. Deadlines, assignments, some stuff that we can work with during the seminars. So read it carefully, print it out, make sure you've studied it carefully. And if there's still any questions that you may have, we can talk about that in the Q&A on Wednesdays between 2 and 5, or you can send me an email. The book that comes with this course is my own, Theories of Violent Conflict and Introduction. It's a book that I wrote particularly for this course. I've been teaching the course for about 15 years now. So in it are basically all the ideas and feedbacks and questions that your predecessors have asked me, and the stuff that we've worked on. So hopefully in the future, when there's a third edition coming out, some of your questions and ideas and feedback are included in the next book. Showing that this is very much an ongoing conversation, and also that the field of conflict studies is constantly changing, and it is in dire need of bringing in young academics and young ideas and voices into the conversation. So there's also a reader pack. I uploaded the reader pack on Blackboard. It's massive. Don't get intimidated. You don't have to read everything. In the syllabus, I've highlighted which readings are really important, so you can just browse through it and read more if you'd like to. But then also there's additional readings perhaps that I will upload on Blackboard. Sometimes something comes along that is interesting, and I'd like to invite all of you to keep an eye out for interesting articles on theories of violent conflict that you think are worthwhile and interesting to discuss and bring into the course, or at least, upload so we can all share and read them if we would like to. And with that, I also would like to invite all of you to, again, make this a joint effort. It's hard enough as it is during Corona times. So if you come across an interesting podcast or a film that is very well highlighting some aspects of the stuff that we talk about, which is often very abstract, so it's great to bring something to life through films and documentaries, please point them out, bring them in. Maybe we can blend them in even into the course structure. So again, let's make this a joint effort. Okay, and with that, I'd like to move on to the more interesting part of what we're here for, and that is the study of violent conflict, collective violence, and war, that we're all sort of fascinated by, and that I assume is something that is something that you're very much interested in. I've asked you to send me a couple of pictures that you think are exemplary for the contemporary state of violence in the world today. And indeed, we are constantly, it's not very hard to pick those images. We are constantly bombarded by images of war and violence. Minsk, Belarus, an ongoing story of protesters, as peaceful protesters, but that find themselves in confrontation with military police, and in confrontations sometimes that turn violent. A very interesting story of mobilization and collective action. Portland, US, but the entire US, as we'll talk about in the in-depth case study analysis course, is in the midst of a multi-level instability crisis that needs to be analyzed and better understood. And I hope we can spend time and energy into using this as a case study also for this case, for this course. Another ongoing story which has not been given a lot of prominence over the past months, the Gilets jaunes in France, another sort of repertoire of contention of people that are very unhappy with unemployment and have other frustrations, and then come together in this under this rubric of the yellow vests. This is a picture sent to me by one of you, another protester again. So there's a lot of imagery coming from collective action, protest and resistance movements. Here, a protester was caught in a web of military police. Very graphic picture. Hong Kong, Hong Kong is another unfolding story. Raqqa, Iraq, is another example of massive warfare and violence. 80% of the city was turned to ruins during the Operation Inherent Resolve airstrikes. Aleppo, Michoacan, Mexico, entire Mexico is now very much confronted with narco traffic violence, very graphic violence where bodies are being laid out to actually convey a message, decapitated, dismembered, cases of violence. Violence that is less prominent or less spectacular is, of course, the increasing use of remote controlled warfare by the US, but not just by the US. This is a picture from Yemen, and that's a topic that we work on a lot in the Center for Conflict Studies. Together with Lauren Gould, I have this research project on the intimacies of remote warfare, which is really trying to capture these forms of warfare and violence. And particularly trying to understand what it does to societies that are at the receiving end of that violence. Now, if we look at all these forms of violence and these images, there's basically two main questions that pop up. How is this possible? And why did it happen? The how question, and they're both key and important questions to ask in our field. The how question is very much geared towards organization. So how is this organized? How is war or violence financed? How are people recruited to join in? What kind of infrastructures, what kind of communication tools are being used? So it's very much about organization, very important question to ask. And then there's this other main question, and that's more about motivation. So why are people ready to sort of sacrifice their lives and die or kill in the name of an idea or an ideology or an identity even? And that's much more about why do people resort to violence? Is it instinct? Is it testosterone? Is it anger, frustration, greed perhaps? And then the classic opposite, grievance, is driving us into this form of behavior. So, and these are the basic two questions that we also work with in this course, and that you'll run into constantly when looking at violence and trying to analyze violence. And also the literature, the different analytical frameworks that we discuss in the book are basically asking this question. So how is violence possible, and why does it happen? Now, I want to take you to a particular case of violence that took place almost 10 years ago. And that is the violent riots that took place in the summer of 2011 in London. I'll present the case to you briefly. So between 6 and 11 of August in 2011, about thousands of people rioted in several London boroughs and in cities and towns across England. The resulting chaos generated looting and arson, mass deployment of police, and resulted in the end of the death of 5 people. More than 300 suspects were arrested. It all started on the 6th of August after a protest in Tottenham in London, which was provoked by the death of Mark Duggan, a local black man who was shot dead by the police on the 4th of August. Several violent clashes with police ensued, along with the destruction of vehicles, in the beginning a double-decker bus, and then many homes and businesses, and then the whole thing rapidly gained attention from the media. Then looting took place in Tottenham Hill Retail Park and nearby Wood Green, and then we could see that the following days and weeks, similar scenes in other parts of London and other UK cities, and even partly even the mainland, resulted from this. Now this may, as a case of violence in the summer, may resonate a lot, because we've seen repeated versions of this kinds of repertoire of violence taking place in cities all over the world, and most prominently, of course, in the US over this summer, often starting with a trigger incident and then turning into much more sustained and protracted forms of violence. Now, if we would look at the how and the why question related to this case, there's many different answers that we could give. So if you just think of why this violence happened, what was driving this violence, and then how was it possible, how was it organized, it wouldn't be hard to, although you don't even know the case, to come up with a number of answers to that question. And it's interesting to see for this, in this old case already, the reaction coming from different voices in society and also from the state level. In relation to the London riots, the Ministry of Interior immediately labeled the London riots as pure criminality, and she argued that there was no justification for such vandalism, and all means should be used to restore order and to punish those who were involved and to step up surveillance, police surveillance particularly. So that was the formal reaction from the state representative. And then we could also hear very different voices coming from more sort of progressive parties and liberals, arguing that violence is a way for people to express grievances and dissatisfaction, and it's very much the lack of economic prospects, particularly for third-generation immigrants, and the constant police harassment and racism that is provoking the violence. So it's much more a grievance-based explanation. It's too simplistic to just call it criminality and vandalism and greed, basically. And then there were many other voices trying to make sense of the violence happening. There were voices that would argue that it's all because of social media that this was possible, so clearly answering the how question. Others would point out that it's not citizens, it's not civilians, it's gang rivalry. So we talk about specialists of violence that were able to step in and keep the violence going. There were others who looked at the shape of the violence, using the word morphology of violence, how a local incident can mutate, can transform into other forms of violence, and how that could explain the ongoing situation. And there was, for instance, the good old Zygmunt Bauman, the philosopher sociologist who died recently. He would argue that the rioters should be seen as defective consumers. I write something about this in the book in chapter 3. And then Paul Gilroy, another academic, would say, well, this is all because the UK has become a securitocracy. Now, what we see in all these different answers is actually, in a nutshell, also partly the debate that we see happening and evolving in the US about why we see the violence in the streets of Portland, for instance. And what we see as conflict analysts is that indeed conflict studies very much out there. It's not very hard to find a lot of the argumentation in less of an abstract and less of a systematic form, perhaps, but a lot of the voices that we hear or that are articulated in the book, and the different positions and analytical frames on explaining the how and why of violent conflict are out there in public debate, and are constantly, in the mouths of pundits and journalists and in your average television show. So we see references made, particularly the first ones, about how it's all criminality driven and greed based, that refer to violence as a very instrumental and rational phenomenon. There's clearly references made to notions of deprivation, which is also an analytical frame that we'll discuss. There's a lot of collective action references. There's ideas about how group competition and group rivalry is actually explaining the violence. And then there's more, and that's increasingly a debate and a genre that we see, becoming increasingly prominent, and that's references to how this is systemic, and how these are forms of structural violence, institutionalized violence, that we have to unpack and understand better. And then certainly there's a lot of discursive formations of illegality and legality, and how violence is very much also a part of a framing dispute. So we can learn from that, from this old case of the UK, of the London riots, that is now sort of repeating itself in different forms in other cases across the world, that a lot of the debate that we see in the public and political discussions is making references to theories of violent conflict. And it's those theories, of course, that we are studying more in depth in this course. And when we look at those theories, again, there's two basic positions that we see underlying the different understandings and explanations of violence, such as the London riots, or such as the Portland violence, and that are views and assumptions about what we are as human beings. So assumptions on being, so what drives human action, what makes us tick, which is in a difficult word called ontology. And these notions are supported by ideas on knowing. So how do we know what we claim to know about violence? And again, with a more difficult word, that's called epistemology. So ontology, which is very much the theory of being, is asking this very basic question about what drives human beings into action or inaction too. So what makes them, passive. So it's a very deep question about who are we as a species? Who are we as a phenomenon, perhaps? Are we essentially always utility maximizers? Are we always trying to calculate what will in the end be helping us to move forward and to how to satisfy our interests? Are we autonomous agents? Are we actually able to make these calculations sort of individually? Or are we much more part of a herd, or sheep that are simply driven by either our inner instincts or by the structures and systems and cultures and scripts that surround us? So who are we? Are we autonomous, or are we slaves? Are we driven by our instincts or by our interests? Those are very big philosophical questions that are somehow always hidden in any theory, in any idea of what drives human beings. And it is important in this course to try and find these underlying assumptions, because they can help us make sense of the explanatory power of those theories, and also it makes it easier for us to relate to them and to either embrace them as helpful or maybe not. And so it is with epistemology, the other big question. Not so much on who we are, but on how can we know? How do we know what we know? Which is a great question to ask as an academic. Basically the question that we should ask ourselves constantly. So how do you know what you claim to know? If indeed the Ministry of Interior argues that the London riots are pure criminality, how does she know? Based on what type of evidence is she making this claim? But the same goes for it's all grievance based. So how do we know grievances? How can we study grievances? How can we then recognize or find indicators that show us that this is actually a grievance form of behavior and other forms of behavior are then greed based perhaps? So how do we do that? So very easily these run into questions of methodology. So how do we trace things? How do we find evidence? What are we looking for to support our position? And then again, there's you'll see, and we'll see throughout our conversations in the book, that there's different ways of answering the question. A group of academics would say, well, we have to systematically monitor what people do. And that helps us to explain actions. So we have to look at them from the outside, we have to carefully monitor them and study them, but we have to study their behavior first and foremost. And that is how we can find knowledge and answer questions. And then there's a second strand of academics who say, no, we have to understand, we have to get inside their heads, we have to really understand people from within. So we have to understand the stories they live by and the meaning-making processes that drive them into violent action. So we have to understand action from the inside. And for that we need not to just look at what they do, but we have to interview them. We have to try and understand what fantasies, what imaginaries, what collective memories drive them into certain forms of behavior. And these are two quite distinct sets of analytical frames that are not very often in the same room, or at least not very comfortably. So in the end, those very basic questions about who are we and how can we know can be placed in what seems to be a very sort of straightforward, yes, seems to be a very straightforward set of positions that we as academics can work from. And I've put them into the Hollis matrix, as it's called, and explained them in the introductory chapter. And this may seem very abstract to you as it is now, but when we move along the book and when we move along the lectures, you'll see that increasingly it becomes more easy to place a certain text into its proper box, to see, okay, when we come to these bigger questions on ontology, on who we are and what drives us, we see a divide between academics that like to answer that question by looking at structures, and we see academics that like to answer that question by looking at the individual. And then if we look at ontology, we see another two sort of schools that I pointed out already earlier. We see academics that like to answer how do we know by focusing very much on behavior and patterns of behavior and studying human beings from the outside, versus another group of scholars who say, no, we have to get inside people's heads. So we have to really understand the cultures and the meaning making and the stories that people tell themselves and others, and that basically drive their sometimes violent behavior. So we see two big divides on knowing and two big divides on being. And if we put them in a box, we basically come to four positions, four ontological and epistemological stances, as we call them in academia. And gradually throughout the course, you'll be able to position yourself in one of these boxes or see, hey, I've been traveling around a little and now I think I'm up there and I used to be down there perhaps. But we can talk about that. Don't get intimidated too much about this whole notion. Gradually, light will dawn over the whole. The main aim of uncovering these deeper layers of assumptions about who we are as human beings and how can we know about violence is to gain theoretical literacy, to make you able to recognize and situate and define and deploy and also critique abstract knowledge on social life, which is what theory is, and particularly abstract knowledge on violent conflict, which is our specialty. And this will help you to argue in the longer run your own position on where you stand in this debate. And that is what academic training comes down to in the end. To learn from others, so to listen to all these different voices of people who sat down and thought about why people resort to violence for a very long time, and then to find your own voice and to see, well, this is basically what I think is convincing, and this is what I take from this course into my own research in the second half of the year. But that's all very far away, and we're going to take it step by step. So we can discuss this on Wednesdays, and the next lecture will start with a very important notion, and that's the notion of identity as one of the answers to the question of what it is that drives violent conflict. And this body of literature would argue identity is very important in understanding why we see the types of violence that we see around us in the world today. So for now, this is the opening lecture, and see you soon in the next one on identity, boundaries, and violence. Bye.